the cross seemed to be something that, okay, it happened, but now we are followers of the risen Jesus. And we love the things and the stories of what He did, and then we put up with the cross. And then we've got the risen Jesus. So you also find, in fact, it has been on our website, and it was also the subject of my Christmas card, a representation from about 250 A.D. of a carved relief of Jesus lying in the manger, with the ox and the ass kind of worshiping Him. But there He is, wrapped up in swaddling clothes, just His face was visible, all these bands around Him, and He's lying in what is clearly a manger where you can see the relief of the straw. And so all of those things were part of early Christian art. The crucifixion was not. It was only later. However, lest we think that the centrality of the cross in the Christian's life was sort of an add-on, sort of something that came from a later date. You know, that Jesus was first of all and foremost a teacher, and then, He was put to death, but God raised Him from the dead, and He continues to be our teacher. That was not part of the faith of the first Christians. The faith of the apostolic church centered on the crucifixion and all of the events surrounding the crucifixion. Now, anybody who has come in a little bit later, I do want you to be sure to get a copy of the notes, because we're going to be using them. They're on the chair back there. What I'm going to ask you to do is to turn to page 11. Now, one of the things that you'll notice, if you don't fold them over, but if you just look at them this way, well, that's why the back page of the back side of each sheet was printed in reverse, so that we could actually look at a whole 2-page spread without having to turn it back and forth. But what I'd like to direct you to is St. Paul first. Everybody knows that I have this thing about St. Paul. And it's a relatively late in life discovery, like Turkey has been as well. And and it goes kind of hand in hand with that. But the more I read about St. Paul, and the more that I read of St. Paul, the more really, really interesting he becomes. And I think there's something that's significant that even a lot of scholars don't really pay attention to. I mean, scholars are really good at dating or trying to get some kind of an estimate. Sometimes it's only an educated guess. Sometimes it's not even an educated guess. Sometimes it's a pretty accurate guess. But when these different books were written, when the letters of Paul were written, when the Gospels were written. But I don't think many Scripture scholars really pay attention then to the implications of when they were written and what that might mean to their interrelationship. I think a lot of scholars tend to look at, well, there's the body of writings by St. Paul, there's the 4 Gospels, and none of them were particularly related to each other, except that it would seem that Matthew and Luke had Mark in front of them. or at least knew Mark, because it's really evident that both Matthew and Luke are quoting Mark. And it's also evident for a number of reasons that Mark is the earliest of the Gospels, coming from around 70 A.D., maybe even a little bit before then, which means Mark was being written in Rome, probably. They're not sure. But Mark's Gospel was being written in Rome around the time that the persecution of Nero had ended, or was coming to an end. And very possibly Mark was written before the invasion of Israel, invasion of Palestine, by the Roman armies to put down the revolt that ended up in the destruction of Jerusalem. So Mark may predate the destruction of Jerusalem. The other Gospels date from at least 10 years later, possibly 10 to 15 years later, and John dates from probably another 10 years after that. Now, with Mark being the first Gospel at about 70 A.D., what Paul wrote, at least those letters that are of undisputed authenticity, which is not all of them, but about 7 of them, scholars are in pretty much agreement that they were written by Paul. Other letters, there's a lot of debate about that. I personally think most of them were written by Paul, but the credentials for their authenticity don't seem to be quite as strong. So, the first of the authentic letters of Paul was written about 50 A.D. Now, bear with me. I generally use the more scientific convention, the more common convention of CE, meaning Common Era, and BCE, meaning before Common Era. That tends to be what scholars use. I tend to go along with it. I will most likely often say AD rather than CE because, well, I'm more used to it. But if one doesn't like Common Era, one can always say Christian Era. But at any rate, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians were written probably around 50 or 51 A.D. Now that means that's about 30 years after the time of Jesus, and about 20 years after the time of Jesus, and about 20 years before the Gospel of Mark. So right in between the death and resurrection of Jesus and the writing of the first Gospel that we have, there is where Paul is writing. And one point that I have made about St. Paul and his writings is that he did not primarily intend his writings to be teaching vehicles. He did not teach by letter. What his letters were for was problem solving. His letters, he taught Christian communities by forming them. He taught them by gathering groups of people around. Sometimes individually. It may have been in the tent-making shop. It may have been in the synagogues. It may have been outside the synagogue, particularly after he might have been thrown out of it. It undoubtedly was in people's homes. But he taught. And it's only speculation. And I think it's very, very interesting because I was reading all of the letters of St. Paul over the past 4 or 5 days in order to compile what I've put together here.